long-term care planning. So if you come to this program before, you've heard me talk about this before. And the first thing I can tell you is that there have not been any major changes in the last few years. So Medicaid has something called a 5-year look back. They look to see if you've made any gifts in the last 5 years. I will often get clients call me and say, didn't they change that to 7 years? No, it's still 5 years, so that has not changed. The only thing that they change is that the number that married couples are allowed to keep gets bumped up by a couple $1,000s each year. So let me go through the Medicaid rules with you. First of all, Medicaid is important if we have anybody in a long-term care facility that is not able to pay their own way or no longer wants to pay their own way. Medicaid is the program that can cover long-term care costs. Medicare, the insurance that everybody who is retired and gets Social Security, they get Medicare. Medicare does not cover long-term care costs. They might cover very short-term stays at like a rehab or a nursing home following a knee replacement or a hip replacement. But if you're just moving into assisted living or memory care and you're planning to live out your time there, Medicare says, no, you got to come up with your own way to pay that. So that's why we're talking about Medicaid. The problem with Medicaid is that not everyone qualifies. It is an asset and income tested program, meaning you need to be under the asset limits in order to qualify for Medicaid. Medicaid treats married people very differently than they treat single people. So if you are unmarried, Medicaid does not allow you to qualify for their program if you have more than $2,000 in countable assets. Countable assets are everything other than what you see listed up here. So you can have one car, one house, and all of your household belongings. You can have very small life insurance policies worth less than $1,500, and you can have a prepaid funeral. Everything else is a countable asset. Your bank account, checking, savings, money market CDs, your IRA, your 401k, and your life insurance that's worth more than $1,500, and any investments, savings bonds, stocks, mutual funds, those sorts of things. $2,000 is the limit. For married couples, you do a little bit better. So the countable assets are have to be somewhere between 50,000 and 154,000. The way that Medicaid calculates that is they add up all of the countable assets and divide by 2. So if you had $300,000 in countable assets, you get to keep $150,000, not $154,140. You only get to keep half of what you start with. Married couples also get to keep one car, one house and household goods, the small life insurance policies, the prepaid funeral and burial for both spouses. But the extra little thing is that the spouse who is not qualifying for Medicaid also gets to keep their retirement accounts. And there is no limit on that. So they don't care if the spouse at home has $100,000 in their IRA or $1 million in their IRA. It's an exempt asset. It doesn't need to be spent down. So for a lot of people, they don't qualify right off the bat because they have too much money. They have too much in assets. So a big part of what I do every day in the office is help people get qualified for Medicaid. So I'm going to go through just a few examples of how we might help someone get qualified. So let's start with a single person, and we've got to single out the single people because they're treated differently. So Mary is single. She moved into an assisted living facility, and the facility cost $5,800 a month. The facility said that she needs to live there for 2 years before they will allow her to apply for Medicaid. That is very common in our area. They don't let you go on Medicaid the day you move in, and that's a facility rule, not a Medicaid rule. So Mary could be under $2,000, and the assisted living she picked says, sorry, we're not going to take you because we don't take Medicaid until you've been here for 2 years. So that's something to be aware of. The facility has their own rules in addition to the Medicaid rules. But so that's very common to see. You've got to be there for 2 years. Mary gets $2,200 a month between her Social Security and her pension. She has $200,000 because she just sold her house and she's got that in the bank. And she also has $100,000 in her IRA. So her total assets are $300,000. And remember, she's only allowed to keep $2,000. So she is $298,000 over the limit today. So how are we going to get her on Medicaid? What we can do is we'll have Mary move all of her money into the bank. So she's going to cash out her IRA. So she's got $300,000 in her checking account now. Of that $300,000, she can give approximately $214,000 to her family as a gift. And then approximately $86,000 is going to go into what's called a Medicaid compliant annuity, which pays Mary a monthly amount. So let's talk about the gift and the annuity. The gift is the money that we're protecting. So that money is going to go to her children or wherever she wants it to go to be protected. That is the money that she does not have to spend on the assisted living in order to qualify for Medicaid. We're going to be able to protect that much of her money. She can either give that money to her kids directly and they can go and put it in a bank account in their names, or she might choose to put it in a trust, an irrevocable trust, which will then eventually be going to her kids or to her beneficiaries, whatever her estate plan is. Either way, it is seen as a gift for Medicaid purposes. And remember, Medicaid looks to see if you made any gifts in the last 5 years. So when we apply for Medicaid for Mary, we will have to say, yes, we gave away $214,000. Medicaid is going to say, okay, because you gave away $214,000, you are not qualified for Medicaid for the next 2 years. But we have a plan for that. That's where the Medicaid annuity comes in. So that $86,000 that we're putting into the Medicaid annuity, we can say that we want that to pay Mary $3,600 a month. It'll be direct deposited into her checking account. And remember from the last slide, she gets $2,200 a month in income and the assisted living costs $5,800 a month. So if this annuity now pays her $3,600 plus $2,200, that equals $5,800, exactly what she needs to make her rent every month. And we can tell the annuity company we want those payments to go for exactly 2 years. After 2 years, all of the money in the annuity will be gone because we've used it to pay her rent. Medicaid will say, okay, it's now been 2 years. You're now qualified for Medicaid. The assisted living will say, okay, you've now been here for 2 years. It's okay if you apply and get on Medicaid. So in some situations, like when I put an example on the board, this can work out really well where we're able to protect a lot of the funds for the family. We're able to pay for that private pay requirement, and we're able to get on Medicaid when the facility says it's okay to do so. So next we're going to look at an example with a married couple. So let's say we've got George and Martha here, and George needs to move into a nursing home. The nursing home costs $12,000 per month, and the nursing home does not have a requirement to be there for 2 years. They say that, you know, if George is qualified, he can go on Medicaid right away, which is more common in nursing homes. They let you go on Medicaid right away. So George and Martha have $100,000 in a CD and $100,000 in stock. So their total of assets is $200,000. And what Medicaid does is they take the countable assets and divide by 2. So of that $200,000, George will not be eligible for Medicaid until we get that down to $100,000. Everything else is still okay. The house, the car, the prepaid funeral. We're not going to worry about that because Medicaid lets us keep that. So what are we going to do with that extra $100,000? So here's another example of how we can get someone qualified for Medicaid. We need to get rid of that $100,000 to get under the limit. So what we can do is take $100,000 from the bank account and loan it to a family member. So George and Martha have a son named Billy, and what they're going to do is they're going to loan Billy $100,000. Now, this loan does need to comply with all of Medicaid rules. You can't just write on a piece of paper, I loaned my son $100,000. It has to actually be transferred. Billy has to put it in his account. It has to leave mom and dad's accounts. And it has to comply with all of Medicaid rules, which includes a current interest rate, equal monthly payments, actuarially sound. So it does need to comply for this to work. But the way that Medicaid works is that once that loan is made, we are now under the $100,000 limit, and we can apply for Medicaid for George. Because when we go to apply, we can say we don't have that $100,000 anymore. We loaned it to our son. So if you look at our bank account, all we have is the $100,000. We are under the limit, and George is going to be eligible for Medicaid. Another kind of weird thing about how Medicaid works with married couples is they only look to make sure you're under that asset limit while you are applying for Medicaid. So once George is on Medicaid, Billy can repay the loan to Martha. Martha's going to end up with all $200,000 still in her name, but George gets to stay on Medicaid because they only want you to be under that limit while you're applying. So with a married couple, we can actually get someone eligible for Medicaid without needing to spend down assets. And here's an example of how we might do multi-step planning. So here we've got Susan. Susan actually attended our program 6 years ago. And at that time, she learned about irrevocable trusts and wanted to use an irrevocable trust to protect some assets. So an irrevocable trust is different than a revocable living trust. So most people, if you've done planning with Mark or Roman or myself, you probably had a revocable living trust set up. The irrevocable trust is used specifically to protect assets from the cost of long-term care. So we set them up when you're worried about the nursing home, taking the house or all the money in the bank or that sort of thing. That's what the irrevocable trust is for. An irrevocable trust has to be set up at least 5 years before you apply for Medicaid because of that 5-year look back. So if you're looking at doing an irrevocable trust to protect your house or to protect assets, you do want to do it at least 5 years ahead of time in order to get the protection. So what might we do? Sue has a house worth $300,000, a bank account worth $100,000, and an investment account worth $200,000. So she's got $600,000 in her estate. We can protect some of her assets by putting them in the trust. So what we might put into the trust is her house and maybe her bank account, or sorry, not her bank account, her investment account. So if we move those two things into the trust, we can potentially protect $500,000 by making that move. So she sets up the trust. Again, we did this 6 years ago. That's going to be important in a minute. 6 years ago, she set up this trust and moved her house and her investments into the irrevocable trust. She still gets to live in the house. Nothing changes with the house. She still lives there. She still pays the heat and electric, property taxes, all of that. It's just titled in the name of this trust now. With the investment account, it's a little bit different. She does not get to use that money. So we would only do this for Susan if we know that she can live off of her monthly income and the bank account that we left in her name. If she's pulling money out of her investments every month to live on, we cannot put them in the trust because she doesn't get to touch it once we put it in the trust. This is really being set aside as an inheritance. It's not for her to live on. So again, if we wait 5 years, we just protected $500,000. So today, 6 years later, now Susan needs to move into an assisted living. She still has her $100,000 in the bank. Everything we put in the trust is protected. So her house and her investments are protected, but she has $100,000 in the bank. So she's not eligible for Medicaid because she's over the $2,000 limit. She's going to move into an assisted living. That's $5,000 a month. And this assisted living only wants her to pay for 1 year, which is also common. They usually say 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. All of those are very common to hear. So for 1 year, she's going to need $36,000 in addition to her monthly income of $2,000. So we're going to put $36,000 into that Medicaid annuity, just like we did in the first example. And then the remaining $64,000 can be protected. Again, we can either give that to her kids directly, or we can add that to what's already in the trust to protect it. Oh, that's my last slide, sorry. So we protected in this example where Susan plans ahead, we protect the full value of the house, we protect the full value of her investments, and now when she's ready to move into a facility, we can still protect more than half of what she had left in her name. So out of her $600,000 estate, she only ends up spending $36,000 on her long-term care. We're able to protect the rest for her. So there are a lot of options, a lot of way that assets can be protected. You know, if somebody, a social worker at the hospital or at the facility says, you know, you have to sell your house, you have to spend down till you have $2,000 in the bank, come back and talk to us when you get to that point. That's not always the case. There are options out there and there are ways that money can be protected.